So I've had my Mac Studio for 1 year. I pre-ordered it with high hopes that it would fix many of my Mac problems. After 1 year, is it still worth buying today? So a year ago, I was using an M1 Mac Mini. I sold my Intel 27-inch iMac in hopes of transitioning my main Mac to Apple Silicon. There weren't really any other desktop options at the time, but I saw rave reviews on the M1 Mac Mini, so I thought I'd give it a try. And boy was it problematic. I had a lot of issues with the I/O and graphics problems, and many users said that I was just using the Mac wrong, but I was anxiously awaiting the Mac Studio, believing that it was going to fix a lot of the issues and quirks of the M1 Mac Mini. Once again, I got viewers commenting saying it wasn't going to fix the problem, and Macs are Macs, they all have quirks, but I can say a year later, the Mac Studio has definitely been the fix to most of my Mac problems. So what is it about the Mac Studio that won me over? Well, let me start with what I like. First of all, the speed is insane. Tasks are all extremely snappy, launching programs, and even doing intensive tasks like rendering 4K video, it's super fast. I never feel like my Mac Studio is slowing me down or lagging. I'm able to do just about any task that I need to do, and I never think about speed or performance. It just works. And for reference, I'm using the base model Mac Studio with a 1TB SSD, so I did upgrade the storage, but everything else is normal. It's the M1 Max, 32 gigs of RAM, so it's not super spec'd out. The next thing I love about my Mac Studio is not something I ever imagined I'd be saying in a video, but it's actually that the fan noise is non-existent. I know what you're thinking. Why does it matter? Computers have fans, they make noise. It's normal. Aren't we all used to rendering video and hearing the fan spin up, or playing a video game and hearing the fan in the background? This is just normal stuff for a computer. Well, that's what I thought too. I heard people mention that Apple Silicon Macs were really quiet, and I was like, why do they care about this? Why are they even mentioning this? But actually, I will say I've really enjoyed the lack of fan noise. When I render 4K video or when I'm working in a timeline, I don't hear the fan, and I've found that it's actually really nice to have a quiet, peaceful environment to work in. And when I've been in an environment with an Intel Mac and someone's doing an intense task and the fan is spinning and it's really loud, I'm like, man, that's distracting, and it really makes me appreciate the lack of fan noise on the Mac Studio that much more. But by far, the thing I like most about the Mac Studio is the I/O. On every other Mac I've owned, I've inevitably had to use adapters and hubs just to plug in all my accessories, but not with the Mac Studio. This thing has 4 Thunderbolt 4 ports, 2 USB-A ports, an HDMI port, a 10 gigabit Ethernet port, 2 USB-C ports, even an SD card slot. The 10 gigabit Ethernet port comes standard on every Mac Studio, and this is really going to future-proof your Mac for any networking situation you may find yourself in. I'm able to run 2 4K displays flawlessly with the HDMI port and one of the Thunderbolt 4 ports. And the Mac Studio supports up to 5 displays, 4 up to 6K in resolution on the Thunderbolt 4 ports, and 1 display up to 4K resolution with the HDMI port. But despite everything Apple got right, there's still some things I don't like about the Mac Studio. First, I do have to compliment Apple for sacrificing some of the design in favor of functionality. In the past, we've known Apple to care about design over functionality with their Macs. We can see this with decisions they've made, like trying to make the MacBook as thin as possible, even if it means sacrificing battery life, just so it's a little prettier and it's a little lighter in your backpack. But it's clear with the Mac Studio, they were willing to sacrifice the design in favor of functionality. I mean, it's not the prettiest Mac, it's kind of a brick that just sits on your desk, but Apple still made some decisions in favor of design, and I wish they would have just gone all out on functionality. They put a lot of the I/O on the back of the Mac Studio, and that's fine, but I can't understand why Apple put the power button in the Mac Studio on the back instead of the front. Every time you go to turn it on, you have to try and reach around, and it's a pain, especially if the Mac Studio is mounted under your desk. There's already a status light on the front, so I don't know why they didn't just make that the power button. And while we're on the topic of buttons, be sure to hit that subscribe button, which is conveniently located right under this video. You don't even have to reach for it. Another design quirk about the Mac Studio that I don't care for is the curves that go right up against the I/O. I don't know if the curve actually starts where the ports are, but I've noticed that the USB-C port on the front closest to the curve and the Thunderbolt 4 port on the back right at the edge is difficult to use. Whenever I plug cables in, it seems like I have to push extra hard to get the connector to seat properly. And I notice frequent disconnections with these ports. It's like you barely bump the connector and your accessory disconnects. I don't know if the curve in the metal actually does start where those edge ports are located, so you're kind of plugging in the cable at an angle, or if it's a flat surface, but I noticed this issue specifically on the ports right next to the edge right before the metal curves. Also, there's just the general instability of Mac OS. Look, I love Mac OS. I use Final Cut, Logic, and other Mac exclusive softwares, and I'm not that person who's just gonna jump ship to Windows because Mac has a few bugs. But it is disappointing that when Apple has full control over the CPUs with Apple Silicon, they still haven't been able to work out all of the random bugs. Things like Finder crashing and relaunching, the wallpaper reverting to the stock wallpaper for no reason when you restart, and random beach balls and freezes when doing simple tasks like launching a program. I've had these issues on my MacBook too, but it's just frustrating that even now that Apple has full control with Apple Silicon, the issues still can't seem to be resolved. So after a year of using the Mac Studio, is it still worth buying today? I think the reason a lot of people are asking this question is because the Mac Studio has not been updated with the M2 chip. The M2 Pro and M2 Max chips have been available on the MacBook Pro for quite a while, but Apple is showing no signs of refreshing the Mac Studio with the M2 chip, so what's the deal? It's believed that Apple is not going to implement the M2 Max and M2 Ultra chips in the Mac Studio because they're saving those chips for the upcoming Mac Pro, and if they put them in the Mac Studio, there would be basically no reason for people to buy the way more expensive Mac Pro. Some people believe that the Mac Studio will get updated when the M3 chips come along, and some people believe that Apple's actually going to discontinue the Mac Studio entirely and that it's never going to see an update past the M1 chip. Personally, I have a hard time believing that Apple would do this brand new design with all this I/O only to discontinue it after one generation, but that's honestly kind of irrelevant to the question of if it's still worth buying 1 year later. But regardless of what you think Apple's going to do with the future of Mac Studio, the M1 Max and M1 Ultra chips are still extremely powerful, and I absolutely think it's worth buying 1 year later. The M2 chips are only slightly more powerful, and if the M2 chips did exist in the Mac Studio, I would probably be saying to buy a used M1 Mac Studio because it's just that good. The I/O offers everything you need, and if you're worried about Apple cutting off software support for the Mac Studio if they were to discontinue it, I don't see this happening. That's because the M1 Pro and M1 Max chips are available in the MacBook Pro, and the MacBook Pro is not going anywhere anytime soon. Since this shares the same internals of the MacBook Pro, I think we could expect 5, 6, 7, maybe even 8 years of software updates before it's obsolete. So yes, I absolutely think the Mac Studio is worth buying 1 year later. But what about the normal M1 chip? The M1 Max and M1 Ultra and the Mac Studio are very powerful, but it's also an expensive computer. So what about something like the M1 Mac Mini? Well, I've got a video about my experience with the M1 Mac Mini that you can check out here.